Okay, that looks like it's it. Let me know when I'm good to begin. I think this is being recorded.
Yeah, we're good to go.
Okay, perfect. So welcome to today's workshop. My name's Jason, and this workshop is going to be on strategy. So a couple of caveats before I begin talking about strategy. First of all, I think in some ways, strategy is quite an individualistic thing. So these are generally applicable things that I personally have found useful, but depending on the manner in which you generate cases, or and to some extent just the manner in which your brain works, this may work better for some of you than it does for me. So this is just advice that both me and other people have found useful. Second caveat before I get into this, obviously people learn debating from it being passed down by others. I didn't get all of this myself. Big shout outs to my coaches, previous coaches, Jamie and Anita, who've both helped shape my strategic view of debating. Big shout out to my friend Ron Lizrovich, who I've talked about debating strategy with probably far too much. And big shout out to my girlfriend Jacqueline Kwan, who has vetted all of this sideshow and made sure I've not gone too overboard with all of the stupid strategic stuff I do. So to kind of establish what we should do strategically when think about debating, it's important to kind of take debating back to its core and ask what debating actually is in order to view it strategically. And I think the biggest caveat to note is that debating is not an activity which rewards the person who generates the best argument in a vacuum, as counterintuitive as that sounds. The metric for debating is not who makes the best argument, but rather the metric is who, within the specific context of that debate, is able to generate what is considered to be the most persuasive thing. That is to say, you are rewarded for winning the debate that is in front of you rather than generating the best possible argument. Subsequently, the way I think about debating is like one of those chess puzzles where you have like a path to victory and you are given like a number of routes to try and get checkmate. I think debating is kind of analogous in that sense, insofar as when you are prepping, you have the motion, you have your route to victory, and you just have to try and maximize your resources to try and get there as effectively as possible without necessarily having to run what is the best in a vacuum. So the crucial ramification of this is that the best, biggest, most important argument typically isn't always the one that wins. Debates are often much more marginal and they are much more strategic than they appear. So, in order to end up sort of winning the game in this manner, these are some sort of generally applicable pieces of advice that I like to dish out for debates, but naturally these differ to some extent based on the individual and based on the occasional curveball motions that CAs will throw where these strategies can't really apply. So debates are won and lost in prep. Your strategy has to start the moment that you get to interact with the motion. And subsequently, the motion should be the first thing that you're paying attention to when it comes to prep. You need to immediately, methodically analyze the motion, communicate any potential misunderstandings about the motion with your partner, because generally people do a couple of minutes of silent prep at the start of debates, but that silent prep is wasted if you guys have different conceptions of what the motion looks like. When you're then analyzing the motion, you need to ask certain questions about the motions. This looks like, why have the CAs set this? Is there something in like real life pertinent to this right now? What specific debate are they expecting? Is there a specific like word choice in the debate, the motion that changes it? Things like the use of the word significantly, things like the use of a word like total abandonment, stuff like that. And then you are able to try and envision what debate is expected, and you are able to preempt what other people are also going to view this debate and work your way around that. So you're able to get the most important questions about what the debate is going to look like just from initially engaging with the motion. You're able to analyze specifically what's likely going to change, who this change is going to affect, and what aspect of the status quo it is going to address. The other crucial important thing to note at the start of prep is regardless of how many what the fuck moments people have when they feel like they get a really lopsided motion, motions have been extensively balance tested. There is no debate is going to be truly one-sided, and in order for at the point you are able to acknowledge that, this is when you are able to engage in effective preemption and you are able to actually engage in the debate that has been laid out in front of you. So this is what the first couple of minutes of prep should always look like. So in order for you to make your prep effective, the specific thing that you need to do is identify what the clashes are going to be in the debate. So all debates are hinged on what is another piece of debate jargon that you'll probably encounter lots of, the comparative. What changes and what doesn't? What is the nature of this change? How big is this change? What are we willing to trade off in order to accrue this change? What benefits are within the purview of either side of this debate when they do not have this change or they do have this change? So the important thing to note, and a good way to save time in debates, is to remember the fact that most debates are centered around the best way to accomplish the same metric rather than debating uncontroversial stuff. Naturally, there is exceptions, but generally debates, particularly policy motions, are centered around people around a single metric, and the debate is whether or not the specific policy in order to accomplish this metric is good. So, for example, debates about feminism probably aren't going to be about whether feminism is good or not. The importance of this then is that given the debating consists largely of resource allocation and the management of your scarce amount of time to try and achieve your desired end goal, when you are able to cut out the time that you would spend explaining why the goals of feminism are good or whatever, at the point that you are able to eradicate these seconds, you are more strategically able to get towards your end goal by delving into what the debate is actually going to be, rather than wasting time on things that people agree on. That's how you get to the clash. So let's take this example motion here. This House believes that government should abandon the strategy of decapitation, assassinating leaders in brackets there, and fighting terrorism. Similarly to what I've explained about the feminism example, this debate is not about whether weakening these groups or not is good, but whether decapitation is the most effective mechanism. At the point that you establish this very early in prep, you are able to much more quickly get to what the root of the debate is going to be about, and you are better able to insulate yourself from the challenges that you're going to get from opposition. Insofar as it is probably a strategic error for them to say that we don't care about weakening these groups, there is likely going to be some sort of counter proposal. This counter proposal maybe looks like addressing root causes. This counter proposal maybe looks like taking sort of like pivotal utility people within the operation down. So your burden then is to specifically prove the unique efficaciousness of decapitation. So at the point that you establish this very quickly, you've already gotten to the root of what you need to prove in order to win that debate within the first couple of seconds of prep. So by streamlining your prep in this manner and very early getting to what the root of the debate is going to be, this is how you are best able to immediately hone in on the strategic clash that you need to win. Weaponizing comparative. So the important thing to note here is that agreeing with your opponent's comparative is not required, and most of the time is pretty unstrategic, because if you just concede to what opening government's comparative is, this means that the thing that they spend all of prep believing that they are going to win the debate on goes to a large extent uncontested. Comparatives are not fixed, and they are up for dispute within the debate. And at the point that you are able to flip the comparative from up, this is when you are able to jeopardize a lot of the government team's prep, and you are able to set your own version of a debate that is more strategically suited to you. So here are two examples of when previous debates I've done where I've flipped the comparative from opening opposition. And just to sort of serve as a reminder that comparatives are not something that you should necessarily believe go uncontested. So the first example is there is a pill that parents may take to guarantee their children are born heterosexual. This House supports the existence of a pill. Kind of a weird motion, but it's been set. The intuitive govline that OG are going to run on is the clash on the sort of discrimination and suffering that children will occur as a result of being born non-straight into specific like conservative communities, and how you are able to prevent your child from accessing that like mean that they will like grow up happier, the metric of happiness of children. The way that we were able to flip this comparative from opening opposition was to say, okay, your entire case is contingent on this occurring specifically within those communities. At the point, the conservative communities are specifically the ones who are least likely going to interfere with the process of childbirth, due to the fact that they believe in things like the sanctity of birth, due to the fact that they may perceive that it is analogous to abortion, stuff like that. At the point that there are all those incentives to prevent this happening in those communities, these communities are unlikely going to be the ones who are going to interfere. The communities who are likely going to interfere are going to be more liberal communities who do not have the same aversion to things like the interfering of childbirth. And even though they are perhaps tacitly accepting of these issues, that doesn't necessarily translate to you wanting to have a child that isn't heterosexual in the first place. So at the point that we are able to respond to the opening government comparative and then introduce a corresponding comparative of our own, we are in a much better stead in this debate than we would have been had we conceded the comparative. Second example, just to give sort of more inspiration for this House would grant new identities to prisoners upon their release from prison. Again, the opening government line is probably fairly intuitive insofar as people struggle to reintegrate to society when they leave prison. They get new jobs and stuff at the point that they're able to do this, no longer discriminated when they are a prisoner. If you were in OO and you were accepting this comparative, you are probably going to lose the debate because it just makes this seem like quite a good idea. The manner then in which you are able to weaponize this comparative is to instead explain, no, there is no comparative in the groups opening government talk about, because there are other factors that prevent these types of prisoners from reintegrating. Maybe these factors look like the same socioeconomic factors that got them in the first place. Maybe their languages changed when they are in prison. Maybe they've picked up things like gang tattoos. There's like a myriad of factors that mean it is unlikely their new identity is going to be a tipping point for these people to accrue change, and opening government have missed their burden. Correspondingly, the groups who there are a change for are specifically individuals like white collar criminals who don't assimilate to prison life to the same extent and who don't serve as long sentences. And subsequently, they are going to be able to reintegrate into society, but they are able to go back and do the same stuff and essentially escape punishment at the point that they have this. So by disputing the comparative there, you are able to strategically shift the debate to where you consider the comparative to actually play out, and then you are able to build your burdens around, first of all, proving your comparative and the harms that occur as a result of it, and second of all, shift the burden back to the other side to not only engage with your analysis and your comparative, but they now also have an additional burden to reprove their one. So strategically competing in the comparative, given all of this would probably only take like 1 minute within a debate, is really strategically useful. How to find the comparative. I think, again, a lot of this comes from the initial actions that you take in prep. The biggest mistake debaters starting out make, and I was really guilty of this until maybe the beginning of this summer, is to think about debates in terms of cases and in terms of arguments. If you think about debate in terms of just an individual case, it's probably going to be really hard to make it relevant at the point that it is going to exist somewhat in isolation, and it is always going to be really easy to be weighed out. This is why it is better to think about debate in terms of clashes and in terms of burdens. The clash is kind of what I've been setting up in this presentation earlier. Who better solves what problem, helps what groups, is more legitimate. Those are some examples of clashes, but basically these are going to be the things that are actually up for contestation in the debate. In order to win clashes, you have to solve burdens within them. So the burdens, they look like the efficaciousness of a policy, they look like the mutual exclusivity of a policy, the legitimacy, the specificity to the motion, and the examples I've provided earlier. Burdens also look like the actual truth of the comparative. So at the point that you begin to think about debating in a wider scope in terms of what the cases will fall under, rather than just the cases themselves, this is when you are able to make substantially more relevant argumentation. How does prep differ when you are in back half? This is a question I get asked quite often. So in an ideal world, every debate is really deep. Every debate has an amazing extension. And if it is a really deep debate, you should try and prep as many of these extensions as possible to a reasonable quality, and then determine which is in the best position to beat your top half as the debate goes on. This is ideally, but in reality, often CA teams are not very good, not the Astana Novices CA team though. And back half, particularly CG, shout out Ron's data, is very undebatable. This is when it is really good to strategically weaponize the burdens that exist within the debate in order to generate analysis extensions. So what do I mean by this? I mean, in a debate that consists of a single clash or a single metric, the best way and easiest way that you are able to win from back half is to sidestep the deadlock that is going on in top half. So explain that neither top half team have really effectively proved what they're going for, and provide a meaningful extension by your opening by analyzing why a burden that hasn't been filled by them is specifically so important within this debate. Analyze why the burden that you are going to fill is necessary for breaking that top half deadlock, and then subsequently you are able to co-opt the entirety of their benefits if you are able to prove that their analysis is reliant on what you've just presented. Generally, this is a useful strategy, but often it results in people creating fake deadlocks and non-extensions. So I think this looks like there are a number of times I've heard closing government teams stand up and say, yeah, opening government are great, but they don't prove why it's legitimate. So we're going to beat them because we fulfill the legitimacy burden, even though that is like a largely meaningless addition on what we've got from opening government, at the point that it just relies on all of our analysis, but tacks on the word legitimacy. That's probably going to be something that ends up getting you a fourth. So try and analyze actual misburdens from the case in order to, and during prep, specifically thinking about the debate in terms of burdens means that it is quite likely that you will have a kind of checklist to rate teams against and try and find the grounds where you believe you're most likely to have extension potential. Framing. So there's loads of workshops on framing. I would particularly recommend the Adam Hawksby framing workshop, but I think it's also useful to briefly include this in terms of how you are able to accomplish the things regarding comparatives and burdens that I've already set out. The famous quote from MDG is that framing is analysis that people don't contest. You should contest framing, but largely this is true in terms of how people actually respond, and it's really important that you effectively use this opportunity. So your framing should typically consist of the very basic problem solution mechanism framework. So you identify the problem in the status quo, you identify a corresponding solution, and you explain what the solution is and why the solution works. What you are able to do beyond this basic framing is to do preemption within your framing and lock other speakers out of a debate. So the way to do this is by consider what I've mentioned earlier about the idea that most debates specifically consist of two different ways to try and address the same problem. What you should then do in framing is to specifically add in it why what the other team are likely going to propose is an insufficient solution for the problem. This accomplishes two important things in terms of one, before the other teams have to even give their speech, they have to address your framing and prove why it is incorrect. And secondarily, even before you've got into your substantive, it has already highlighted why your specific solution is going to be unique. Let's consider a framing example of a motion we've got set at Thailand Worlds. This house believes that the Mexican government should adopt measures that enable one cartel to monopolize the drug market. The problem is intuitive insofar as drugs and cartels are rampant in Mexico, with innocent individuals, repeatedly caught in the crossfire. The solution is that the government allows one cartel to monopolize, at the point that you collaborate with the cartel to eliminate competitors through things like targeted arrests, targeted attacks, targeted patrols. This is specifically when you reduce things like skirmishes, when there is no longer violent competition over the drug market, when people are more easily able to access a monopolized provider of drugs without the fear of reprisal from another cartel. So the importance in terms of the strategic framing of this is, if you are able to characterize why the status quo is so bad, why other institutions like the police have been ineffective at dealing with it. This is due to things like entrenched corruption. This is due to things like rampant underfunding. What you are able to do within this framing is you are able to almost immediately rule out any potential other proposal that the opposition will have. And you are able to explain that this debate just has to be about the mitigation of harms to people on the ground at the point that this situation is already so bad. It would probably be an unwise opposition to say that this debate is not about mitigating those harms. Therefore, they already have a huge burden to engage with the framing and to explain why something is going to be successful, when you've already just taken a couple of seconds to reasonably clearly prove that there's an entrenched problem that's not likely going to be fixed. How to win debates then, sort of collating all of this together. So debating is about resource allocation, by insofar as you have to establish very early what is actually going to be disputed and then construct the burdens around that. In addition to not wanting to analyze or waste time on things that people aren't going to dispute, you don't want to bother analyzing or framing things other teams can concede. You don't want to bother wasting time on things that aren't mutually exclusive. And in addition, you need to kind of be realistic in the manner in which you are framing the debate. So, like, as much as CA teams will sometimes fail to set a balanced motion in terms of back half depth, usually debates are going to go through extensive motion testing, and subsequently there are going to be arguments on both sides. So the strategy for you to win the debate isn't going to be you proving that your side is perfect and you proving that the other side is entirely wrong. You need to establish very early in prep what trade-offs you are willing to take in order to try and get to the end result of emotions. And so far as debating is a game based on the sort of aggregate number of trade-offs and clash wins that teams take, and the specific priority that you are able to assign to trade-offs, I think it looks like you being willing to accept a trade-off on your side, but proving why the trade-off that the opposition have to take is something that is disastrous. You need to be willing to prioritize what you can concede, prove what the opposition cannot concede, constantly prove not just the truth of things, but also the importance, and get into the habit of saying, even if opposition are right, here's how we still win at the end of every sentence as if it's a comma. This is a little checklist where, using that information, you are able to strategically win debates. But most of you have probably already been told this, so here's kind of a little cheat list on manners in which I actually, on like strategic ways in which I go about trying to win debates. And I think the thing to hark back in when moving into this section of the presentation is to address the thing I said in the introduction, where I think particularly with novices, there's a tendency in debates to think that if you have the biggest impact, you're going to win. And there's subsequently a tendency and a pressure that individuals feel to try and prove the biggest impact ever. But I think most debates are extremely marginal, and this is egregiously true in three instances. International relations, for some reason it says IR twice, but that should say international relations, narratives, and social movement debates. I think the reason for these is fairly intuitive. We're a bunch of university students. These are either like philosophical complex things, or these are like intense social and international issues that have been raging on in reality for years and years. We're not going to solve them after 15 minutes of prep, and you need to acknowledge that in prep in order for you to actually produce a case that is going to be strategic. So rather than try and dodge the fact that you're probably not going to solve this entirely in 15 minutes of prep, you need to embrace it, and you need to be a team that realistically engages with the capabilities of what your speeches can accomplish. At the point that you acknowledge that, you are probably already ahead of most of the speaker pool. Embracing this marginality is especially useful in back half, because OGs in particular in debates always panic in prep and massively overstep the bounds of reality in terms of what they are able to effectively prove within 2 7-minute speeches. If you in back half are able to cast doubt on the debate that top half have, you are able to effectively try and win on a marginal comparative that is much easier to prove. And as long as you are able to reasonably prove that the debate that top halves are having is something that is out with the realms of reality. I think the easiest ways to do this are to, one, highlight the missed burdens that top half have, and secondarily, to try and explain that top half's impacts are so big that it's likely that they occur non-unique to the motion, whereas the specific motion's actual changes are going to be those that are more marginal, more on the ground. Therefore, on metrics of not meeting burdens or not being unique, you are able to wash top half and win on a small comparative. This is probably the most effective and realistic strategy in the majority of debates that look low impact. When do you know when to make your strategy this one of marginalizing the debates? So my good friend Ron Lesrovich taught me the sanity check that you should apply when trying to determine whether a debate is low impact or not. And it is to ask at the end of every debate, every like piece of your case, if I suggested this change to my mum, would she buy it? And the important thing to note here is, if that's the case, your mum will buy it, then the judge probably will too. Judges have to judge from the perspective of the average reasonable informed voter. They are capable of understanding complex change, but it has to be adequately mechanized and be within the realms of plausibility. Therefore, if you don't feel like you would be able to explain your case to your mum, and your mum would look at you like, what are you talking about, Jason? I think it is probably quite reasonable that the judges will have the same response. At the point then that it is easy to prove, it is reasonably easy to win on it. And so far as once you are able to prove that something is true, you have done most of the hard part. And then it just becomes about proving it's important, proving it's mutually exclusive. And the way that you are best able to prove it is important is to frame out the other claims by proving them as non exclusive or non occurring. You should do this in a way that doesn't knife your opening, but ultimately you are able to do it as a means usually of deprioritization, highlighting missed burdens and highlighting non-exclusivity is the best way to do that in a manner that doesn't constitute responding to your opening. So this is often my go-to in back halves, because I think it aligns with the current trend of the types of motions that are being set right now. And I think it also aligns with the mistakes that debaters in top half frequently tend to make. The risk that you always carry with this is that in certain debates, making your case too marginal leaves you without much of a case at all, particularly in instances where you have a top half that haven't made these mistakes and haven't met and have actually met their burdens. This is when it is probably more accurate to try the second strand, the second strategy to this, to explain that maybe they've met their burdens, but to do maybe 2 or 3 minutes of framing to explain why there are other context developments that mean you're probably likely going to get those changes to some extent on either side of the house anyway. Deprioritize your opening in that way and win on a unique margin. So the common metrics to apply for these marginal increases that you're going to get are incremental consequential boosts, like economic boosts, like boosts regarding awareness and stuff, internal effects to individuals and behaviors within movements, and stuff like principles also really nicely apply here when you are able to weigh it by saying top half have two uncertain values. I don't know which one to adjudicate on. Here is a principle that has certain value. These are typically the margins that you are able to try and win on from back half. So the example motion I use for this house believes that the feminist movement should spread the narrative that women should act in sisterhoods rather than look out for themselves. I don't think this was the exact wording of the motion, but it's functionally identical. So the two huge red flags that you should have immediately got from this motion, if you were prepping it in the manner that the initial slides have suggested, is that this debate isn't going to be about much because it has both the red flags of it being about narratives and about being a social movement. Narratives don't affect people that much, particularly when spread by a social movement whose narrative is already frequently accessed through secondary sources and is deprioritized in people's individual calculus due to a frequent lack of urgency. This would be the framing that you would have when trying to win in the margins. You're able to very easily immediately prove that the spread is likely going to be in a low scale level through things like feminist literature, spokespeople, advertisement of support groups, all those mechanisms. The clash is then about what marginal responses people have. And so far as this probably isn't going to be the tipping point for like feminist issues to be solved or whatever, it's very tempting for op to overstep these margins to explain that people will respond so badly that they will either abandon the movement entirely or men will have huge amounts of backlash to it. But I think the burdens of proof required to prove that this narrative is spread by this movement reaches big impacts is going to be really hard. The much more strategic route to take in this debate is to explain that this narrative occurs at a reasonably micro level. You win the debate off of marginal increases to funding, lobbying power, inter-movement awareness of different types of issues, and the capacity for the movement to function as a safe space. So by proving that these are unique to this narrative, and are actually accomplished by this narrative, this is when you are able to sidestep a lot of the big impact messes that typically occur in debates that don't have that big of an impact. But obviously it is difficult sometimes to make sure that the margins actually win. Here are a couple of steps to try and make this strategy work. I think the big one and the one that I constantly fall victim to is not to use teams having a high burden as an excuse to not engage with them. It's not enough to say these things probably don't happen or these things probably happen on either side, depending on which route you're going down. You also have to actually engage in rebuttal to make sure that you are also engaging with the best version of their case. So not only do you provide the framing to frame them out, but you should also do an even if to explain why, even if it's something that you want to consider relevant within this debate, here is why it is also not true. Strategically, I would always try and prove the lack of relevance of something prior to proving that something is untrue, but some people like doing that in a different order. Secondly, I think you need to be careful with your word choice insofar as you kind of want to psychologically sell this to judges better. What I mean by this is you shouldn't admit that it's a small impact. You should say something like it's a realistic impact or a grounded impact or a plausible impact. All of that stuff to make it seem like everybody else in the debate has been a bit stupid except you. This kind of leads on to the third thing. Stand up, there's times I've stood up in framing and I've been like, I don't know what top half was, or I have no idea what debate I've just watched, or other stuff that allows you to act extremely confused as to what other teams have been up to, basically accuse them of missing the debate. And at the point that you are able to sort of slide that into your framing, it makes it look like you are the only team who is actually debating the motion as it was intended, and you're able to wipe out teams both literally by doing the framing and psychologically by trying to transfer onto the judges. And I think, fourthly, you need to try and underpin underpin how changes work in terms of marginal things happening. This might sound somewhat counterintuitive to what I've said already, but what I mean is the actual like mechanisms of change that occur in reality probably do occur through really small shifts in things. Like small shifts in voting patterns are enough to swing huge decisions. Small shifts in capital are often the difference between a group being able to lobby effectively or provide more material benefits to people. At the point that you are able to explain that, yeah, maybe this is marginal, but here is why these specific margins are so important, you're able to win not only in the plausibility of your impact, but if you're able to prove this well enough, you're also able to prove on the actual scale of change. So these are how you are effectively able to turn these marginal incremental increases into a winning case. But there are a lot of instances where this strategy is not going to be the wisest. And I think the biggest signal for when this strategy isn't going to be the wisest is twofold. I think firstly, when you're in a top half position, it makes you extremely vulnerable to a high impact closing who run something like, I have no idea why opening government's case is so low impact. Here is why we are going to break this debate. Secondly, I think when debates reasonably clearly provide a high impact, quantifiable material benefit to large groups of individuals, it's useful to actually go in the opposite direction. So the example I've provided here is this house would arm women in the USA. In the last slide, you may have gone, we would send women in dangerous areas a revolver after they go through extensive training. What this debate should signal to you is that there is a specific, like, big scale change to a lot of people that is quantifiable. It's therefore strategic to go the opposite way and to say, we will send every single woman a Glock 16 in response to this. There's a couple of reasons for this, because first of all, when this is a clear-cut policy, it feels like it's shirking your burden if you add loads of caveats to it, and subsequently you are likely going to get either called out by your opening or extended upon past a closing who are willing to bite this bullet. Secondly, if emotion seems crazy, that's probably deliberate insofar as AGCORs set crazy stuff a lot, and that is probably the reason why they have said it. Thirdly, in a simple metric debate like this, high burdens, rather than washing everything, make things clearer to judge, particularly when you are somebody from front half, and making sure that you don't add loads of caveats and you give a very clear high impact comparative to be adjudicated on, makes the judge's job really easier and particularly favors teams in OG. And yeah, as I've alluded to, and the opposite from the last series of slides, these motions acquire no benefit from washing things due to the clear-cut, quantifiable nature of them. Subsequently, you are just going to look like you're trying to dodge the debate if you soft prop it. I think I was going to remove this slide, but it looks like I have time, so I'll go for it. I think the reason why I included this slide, despite these things being workshops in themselves, is that when trying to think about how to strategically fit yourself into a debate, particularly in back half, principles and narratives are important because talking about narrative, this is typically where debaters are atrocious at debating narratives. People are really bad at trying to actually mechanize how narratives are spread and how individuals respond to them. Consequently, in a narrative debate, um, the the debaters before you are disproportionately more likely going to have missed their burdens on the mechanisms of change than in any other debate, and the debate is far more likely to be marginal than in any other debate. So by bearing this in mind, you're really able to strategically meet your burden when thinking about narratives by always trying to bear in mind analyzing how they are spread, how individuals respond to them, what this narrative does to someone, how they internalize it, what actions they take as a result of them. All of these little steps within a narrative debate are burdens that teams constantly miss. And given this, spending prep, fleshing them out, enables you to strategically win on stuff that other debaters may accuse of being wishy-washy and too hard to effectively prove. The reason why I've also included principles in this debate, in this presentation, is that when I was first struggling with coming up with extensions, speaking with my first international partner, Libby, Libby explained to me that a really strategic way to think about extending is that there is always a principle. I think this is probably true in the majority of instances, and I think it's also a strategically wise thing to consider because of what I've alluded to earlier. When top half is a mess in terms of either high impacts that haven't been proven or low impacts on either side, but there is a certainty question about who achieves them, and you want to sidestep that quagmire in terms of the certainty clash. I think a principle is really strategically useful because you are able to weigh it in terms of its certainty. The other ways in which you are able to weigh this strategically is to explain that principles generally underpin things that most people care about. I think this looks like the prevention of harm to individuals. And additionally, principles are specific foundation points for large institutions and large things of change that we care about. This looks like states being able to do things on the basis of being just or being legitimate. So if you're worried about strategically using a principle and it not being bought within this debate, try and underpin a practical within it. The classic example of this looks like if the state is perceived as illegitimate, individuals are going to have less buy-in and less engagement with the state. Flesh something like that out, and you're able to have it exist on two caveats. Secondly, principles should use plausible examples. The fancy debater word for this is intuition pump. A classic example of this is when talking about bodily autonomy, explain why nobody would stand over people having their organs forcibly removed. Therefore, given it is analogous, we should protect individuals' bodily autonomy by the state. So you're able to strategically use principles to justify the actions that your opening has taken, to contest on multiple metrics, and to provide a clear-cut way of weighing in messy debates. So it's useful to bear in mind those ways of weighing it, despite this not being specifically a principle workshop, useful to have that one slide. Another thing I often get asked by novices when we're starting off debating is how to strategically utilize points of information. And the number one biggest mistake that people use when starting out in POI is to do point of information and be like, aha, but what if actually the thing that you said was wrong? Because all this means is that the person who's received POI is able to be like either, oh yeah, it is, but here's why it's not important, or to immediately fix that thing. So the important things that you need to do to strategically utilize POIs are, first of all, do so in a communicative manner with your partner. This is particularly important during online debating. POIs are things that are probably the most collaborative aspect of speeches and are things that you should kind of in unison be determining what you are going to push against the other team. Insofar as POIs are also useful to flag up in speeches, it's probably good that you are on the same page in terms of giving it. Secondly, particularly when you are in opening, POIs are the only real opportunity that an opening team has to weigh their bench against their closing. So try and weigh your bench strategically when you are offering POIs to try and use the POI to attack not only the opposing team, but to also explain why in relation to the team on your bench, you are also more important. Thirdly, POIs are useful, particularly to the first speakers in the debate, to do two things. Rather than just do the gotcha and take out one thing of the case, you should use a POI to impose a burden, because what this does is it forces the team to either try and prove that that's not the burden or to try and meet the burden, and either way that will align well with the strategy that you have hopefully come up with in prep. The second thing that you should do is find a piece of analysis that the rest of the case is contingent on, and try and target that specific contingency, because it means that if you are able to disprove that, you don't have to engage with the subsequent analysis that comes as a result of it, although you probably should do on even if. Next one, this one is slightly more controversial, but I think it is better debating if you are in the back half when POIing the deputy to let them engage with your extension, because this means that you are already able to make it the best possible version of an extension it could be once you get to clash it against the responses they have already given. Probably though better to give this to deputies because it's less likely to be stolen by top half. And when you are a top half team that feel like you are not being engaged with adequately in the debate, you should specifically flag the pivotal pieces of analysis that you have given and impose a burden on them to engage with it, as long as they genuinely haven't engaged with it before and you think that is important. That leads on to the things not to do in a POI. I'll start with one at the end first. A lot of people, when giving POIs, try to flag their case, but they just flag stuff that has already been rebutted and don't provide any new insulation from the responses that have been given. All that amounts to is it being a waste of engagement. Next thing not to do is to call out things that a judge is probably already noticing. What I mean by this is a judge has probably noticed a knife if it is extremely blatant. A judge has already probably noticed that there is a degree of non-comparativeness. You should try and take cases at their best when you are POIing, because these huge flaws within a case are things that you should trust the panel to already be noticing. Obviously, if for whatever reason you think it's small enough that the panel haven't noticed, probably worthwhile flagging. And then, as I alluded to in the introduction, it's probably not worthwhile highlighting things that can be easily fixed within a POI, as that is a waste of engagement. Cool. So since there is a couple of people in the chat, I'm going to do a little example of strategy to see if people have taken in what this prep looks like. So the strategy example I've given here is that this house would lower the burden of proof for crimes with low conviction rates, e.g. sexual assault, e.g. gang violence. This had a big info slide, but I decided to leave it out. So I want to ask 3 questions about this debate, and I'll get the chat open for if anybody wants to contribute. If not, I will do it myself if everybody's feeling a bit shy. What is the aim of emotion? What are the clashes of emotion? And if you were OG or if you were CO, how would you strategically think about this motion? It was indeed the Zagreb final. I'll give a minute for if anybody in the chat is feeling inspired. Okay, cool. I have the slides prepped anyway, so it's all good. So the aim of emotion. I think the aim of emotion is probably the simplest in this, in terms of the fact that the comparative has been laid out very clearly for you within the motion, and subsequently it's very intuitive what problem this motion is attempting to solve, in terms of it flagging that low conviction rates is specifically a problem for types of crimes in order for the justice system to function. The clashes then and the aim of emotion consist of trying to determine who is able to get a better justice system within the debate and who is able to get more accurate convictions, and subsequently a couple of things stem from that in terms of, one, justice, in terms of victim retribution, in terms of the accuracy of punishing criminals. So the clash is specifically when within seconds you are able to determine from the clearly laid out comparative what the clash is going to consist of. The question then is, how are you strategically going to approach that clash, and how does it differ when you are in opening government or when you're in closing opposition? Let's talk about opening government. I think opening government's biggest strategic decision probably from here is which type of crime to hone in on. And I think the best strategy here from OG is to probably frame that the specific reason why people lack confidence in the justice system, the place where there's the most scope for change in terms of just how many people get off, is in terms of the low conviction rates of sexual assault. And so far as this is the biggest and most achievable impact, opening government are able to reasonably prove that this is the metric the debate should be judged on. The other thing that you are able to do in framing from opening government as preemption is to try and wash the other things to make them less important. So within your framing, you're able to explain things like gang crime being a consequence of problems with policing or societal narratives, rather than it specifically being unique to the justice system. So within your framing, you have already strategically proven that what you are going to hinge your case on is the biggest scope for change in the debate, and not only is the biggest scope for change in the debate, is the only real scope for change in the debate. So within 3 lines of framing, you've accomplished a good strategy. Conversely, the CO strategy is nearly a direct clash. What you have to instead do from CO is you probably need to contest the comparative the opening government have set out. You need to wash the idea that it's going to be sexual assaults that are the comparative in this debate, explaining that this is due to factors like policing being intrusive. It's due to factors like juries disproportionately not believing women. It's due to the specific power asymmetries between who these criminals are, who the victims are, the type of representation and respect that they are able to get. So at the point that you are able to contest this comparative, you then provide a comparative of your own, and you say that because of things like gang crime being easy to sell to juries because of its pre-existing societal narratives, due to things like policing structures on tough on crime and the fact that conviction rates are their metrics for promotion, the fact that even if the problems exist outside of specifically the conviction rates, the change in conviction rates is going to also change the actions of individuals outside of this process, and therefore this is a comparative, this is how individuals respond. I think the important thing that is established by this strategy is that, by these strategy examples, is that often teams will be directly clashing in terms of the strategy that they engage in. So picking the right strategy isn't some sort of like silver bullet. You have to do all the analysis outside of it to like prove that your comparatives are true, to do the analysis within it, when often strategies, if people are debating in the same strategic manner, are going to contest directly with one another. So I think that was the importance of including these 2 specific examples that result in applications of the same strategy, but to largely totally mirrored outcomes. And with that, I think that's the end. There was meant to be a photo of my dog here, but it didn't seem to carry on to the PowerPoint. I'll be checking the chat if anybody has any questions.